Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today, we're joined by the mayor of Canada's third largest city, His Worship, the Mayor of Vancouver, Kennedy Stewart. Mayor Stewart has been in the role since 2018 and previously served as a member of parliament federally for the British Columbia riding of Burnaby South, where he was a member of the NDP caucus and served as their critic for science and technology. He holds a PhD in world cities from the London School of Economics and taught as a professor at Simon Fraser University's School of Public Policy before beginning his political career. So Mayor Stewart, thank you very much for coming on the program today.
My great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so really exciting conversation. Really looking forward to having this one. And if you've listened to the episode at all before, or people who have, they'll know I always like to start with a bit of a table setter. And so it's worth pointing out that most of our listenership is across the country, political staff, civil servants, what have you, in Ontario, out west, in Quebec. So they're obviously familiar with Vancouver, but they may not be familiar with the exact issues and the local context happening in the city. So there's one thing that everybody probably associates with Vancouver off the hop, no matter where they are in Canada, and that's housing prices. So as the table setter, let's start with that. I saw recently that a 2-story home in Vancouver, the average price was going for a listed 1.7 million. We see some high home prices in Toronto and Montreal. We don't necessarily see this consistency of high home prices that you have in Vancouver. So let's start with that. What's the housing reality like on the ground, and how have you been tackling that issue as mayor?
Sure. So just before I get to housing, hello, and thanks for having me on today. I just wanted to say, if you ask Vancouverites, the top issue is, of course, right now is COVID-19. So that maybe we can talk a bit about that as we get into the podcast. The housing is definitely the second issue, and it has been for a long time. But the third is the overdose crisis. So we, have access to polling quite regularly on these issues, and those are the top three things. So happy to talk about housing. The other thing too is just for those who aren't as kind of politically inclined, we are the third biggest region in Canada, but the city of Vancouver is home to about 650,000 people, and so I really look over the core of Metro Vancouver with 20 other municipalities kind of in the surrounding area. So just to give you a context of what we're dealing with, it's really just the core. My jurisdiction is the core of Vancouver. So in terms of housing, again, the public tell us, through polling, that there's really the top issues for Vancouverites. The first is I can't buy a home. The second is I can't rent a home, and the third one is I don't have a home. So it's purchase, it's rental, and then it's homelessness. That's constantly on the minds of Vancouverites. So those are a lot of things to unpack. And so would you want me to? Which one of those would you like me to?
Well,
start?
I mean, we're using your time here, so I say we go through all three of those issues you mentioned and all three of those housing issues. But let's start with the availability of homes, because one of the things that we always kind of talk about in Toronto, and I've heard an interesting comparison to Vancouver, is Vancouver's got the ocean on one side and mountains on the other. Toronto's got Lake Ontario and then land use planning issues. Is it an availability of land? Is it land use planning reforms? Like, what's driving the lack of affordability for homes in the area?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the core city, but of course this spreads out across the region as well. I would say it's not a land shortage problem. I think it's a land use problem. I think we have 68,000 lots in the city that are designated for single detached homes, and you can often have a basement suite or a laneway house or a coach house in it, but it's not really, it doesn't drive the affordability of housing. So we're finding now that even lots that were single detached homes that you can make into duplexes, by the time you get it finished, it's close to the price of the original lot anyway. So, I think it is that, and the thing is, we're not, I had a guy saying to me the other day as I was walking my dog, he said, I need a 3-family home and, a 3-person, 3,500 square foot home in Vancouver. I need a backyard, but I can't have it be $5 million. And I'm like, well, we just can't build that. Right. So, I mean, the thing about a core city, global city like Vancouver, it's got to be about density, and there are always trade-offs, and part of that is space. So I think we're stuck at the moment. Is that, I moved to Vancouver in the late 80s, and it was a much different place then. There wasn't the kind of we didn't have the pull of a global city, but we certainly do now. And you think of the big companies starting to land here, like Amazon and Facebook and Google, and we're kind of in a very different place. But our plans for the city haven't really modernized. So we can't produce any more lots, so we have to do more with what we have. And so that's been my thrust here in terms of affordable housing to buy, or more affordable, is to try to densify some of those single detached lots. And so I put a proposal forward last year to council for a pilot program where we take 100 lots across the city, and we would enable owners to build up to 6 units on that single lot, as long as 2 were protected from the market. So we put covenants on those two units, so they're forever affordable. They'd be protected from speculation and rampant increases in price. However, council voted that down. So and so that's why I think we're kind of stuck here, is that we need political will. I definitely have it. I put proposals forward. I'll be going back at that again this year, but that's only a pilot project. Mm-hmm. I mean, in my mind, I think we have to. What I like about a pilot is it allows us to play with different financing models. So some people might build a co-op in those 6 units. Some might do co-housing. There's all kinds of financial models and form models. So architects can try all kinds of different ways. We don't want a kind of a standard cookie cutter approach. And then once we learn from the pilot, I think we could expand this program. And I did get the thumbs up when I put this forward. The CMHC, Evan Siddle, kind of gave me a Twitter thumbs up, like, we need to do this. And so I feel like that is the answer, but we need the political will to get there.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, one, on the different forms, you can do rent to own and all these different types of situations that work for different types of people, which is interesting. But there's only so many tools that you have at your disposal in the toolbox. The province has a foreign home buyers tax in place. One of the things that you talked about in your mayoral campaign and throughout your time in mayor has been a vacancy tax. I think about 1.25%. So how are those tax tools working to help free up some supply and keep some prices low for people?
Yeah, I think we were a bit of denial in the city here. Everybody thought it was foreign buyers that was buying up everything. And so there's been a whole raft of demand side measures. So we have a empty homes tax, we call it here in Vancouver. It started at 1%. We moved it to up slightly, but I recently put forward a motion and council approved it to triple it. So we'll be at 3%. And that's had a tremendous effect of driving these empty homes owned by speculators back onto the market, and it's raised us a bunch of revenue to build more homes. So that's been very successful. The province has also put in a speculation tax. I think the province has put 3 different other taxes. So I think we put in 5 demand side measures in total, with the feds looking to put another one in. The other thing that started to happen, though, is we have a lot more data on what's going on within our city and across Canada. This has been generated, actually, a motion I put forward while an MP, while Bill Morneau was the finance minister. He agreed to do this, and now we're starting to get data that shows that it's mostly local people, Canadians, mostly local, that are buying 2, 3, 4 properties, and that's what's really driving the value up here of properties is kind of local. They're buying surplus housing for themselves. Mm-hmm. So that is something I've talked briefly with federal housing minister Medicine about. Maybe this isn't something we can do at the city, but maybe there's something we can do to make it harder to buy those 3rd or 4th homes that are only used for often local speculators.
So, I want to be cognizant of what you said on the top about housing, the pandemic, and homelessness, or rather overdoses being 3 of the big issues. So sort of transitioning into that second one of the pandemic, one of the things that has been happening in Toronto, and Statistics Canada says it's happening in Vancouver to some extent, is people moving out of the city towards rural parts, perhaps cottages or other properties. Noted that between Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, some 87,000 people have left the city for other parts of their existing provinces. So is that actually something that's happening on the ground as a result of the pandemic in Vancouver? And if so, are you concerned about that trend at all?
I guess a couple things. First, if you look at StatsCan data again, in core cities, there's a tremendous churn of people anyway. I mean, if you're coming to a city, you land usually in the downtown core, you rent, and then you try to find your way. Often you transition out. So that's definitely the case in Vancouver. And we hear this a lot about people quote unquote kind of abandoning their homes and moving into the suburbs, which is they're selling them to somebody,
Mhm.
right? So I mean, our population isn't declining, it's going up. And so what's changing though is the demographic of the city. So the units are all occupied. We're making sure of that with the empty homes tax, but they're occupied by different people. And that's my concern, is that the workforce is being basically shoved out of the city and into the suburbs. And so especially, younger people. So that is why proposals like by making home, where we densify these single detached homes, and then younger people and workers could get in to purchase to build equity, but also a huge focus on secured rental builds.
So we should point out, it's mid-May as we're recording this episode. It'll be released in early June, and in the pandemic, that 2 week period is a lifetime. Lots
Yeah.
of things happen. So,
Yeah.
vaccine rollout will continue, and hopefully we get closer and closer to the end of this thing. But do you think that movement of people outside the city, the demographic change that you were speaking about, the workforce being forced into the suburbs, is that something that's accelerated by the pandemic? Was that a trend that was happening beforehand, or is this a new side effect of the pandemic that we hadn't seen before?
I think that the pandemic has drawn more people to invest in real estate, and we can see, and it's also dampened supply a bit. So it has driven up prices, and that people who are renting, young people who are renting in Vancouver, who maybe had their eye on purchasing, are now saying, I just can't get in, and then they're looking outside the metro, outside Vancouver, outside metro, and even outside the city. So again, my concern is it's not so much empty apartments or condos downtown; it's the equity of how equitable is our living situation, and it's not. So if you have to have a $300,000 or $400,000 down payment in order to purchase a house, I mean, it's out of reach for
Mhm.
all but the people with the most money. So yeah, so I mean, there is a big concern here, and really the first way to tackle it is to build rental that people can afford, and also is secure, because when you're renting condos, you're at the whim of the landlord. But when you're renting secured market building, where it can only be rental, it can never be sold, and it's usually owned by one company or a pension fund or something, you can build a life there and not be evicted or whatever. So that has been a huge thrust of the work over the last 2.5 years.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and getting to the pandemic more directly and sort of
Mhm.
less about its side effects, but the management of it. I mean, I got to say, I don't envy being a politician in the time
Mhm.
of balancing the public health restrictions and the safety of people and the economy.
Yeah.
Um, that said, British Columbia and Vancouver in particular, compared to other places in Canada, seem to have done a much more balanced job. There have been fewer severe swings towards one side or the other. I mean, a lot of indoor services, gyms, hair salons, that type of thing have been open for a majority of the pandemic. They may not be right now, but they have been for a long time. I think outdoor patios are still open. And in places like Toronto and Montreal, it's been 300 or 400 days for some of these businesses before they've been open. Why, just sort of for edification of listeners who aren't in the Vancouver, BC area,
Yeah.
why has Vancouver and BC more generally been able to keep this healthier balance between restrictions and the economy?
Yeah. Uh, so first, I think a lot of it's got to do with climate. So I know you were talking about Toronto, Montreal. I mean, John Tory and Valerie Plant have just done amazing work in their cities. I mean, I talk with them often through the Big City Mayors forum that we have. But like, we had like one day of snow here, so people can really sit outside all year round. We opened a ton of public space. So under our bridges, we have put public furniture so people can gather under there. We did this. I think we've had almost 550 patios, outdoor patios added. So we, right at the beginning, focused on keeping people outside, and even if you have to sit out with your umbrella or under some kind of awning, there still is a capacity to stay outside and not to go inside as much. We're in Toronto and Montreal, that's much different.
Mhm.
Also, and I can't speak for the other cities, but we had a tremendous kind of, this is about all of us together right at the beginning of the pandemic. We didn't have a ton of, anti-mask stuff going on or anti-vaccine, not very much. And really the businesses have been fantastic. They've been very safe because they had an uptake on the public health orders. The other thing we also, and I made this kind of priority when I declared the first state of emergency in the history of the city, is that we would focus on the most vulnerable people in our city that are mostly concentrated in the downtown east side. So we poured massive amounts of resources into that neighborhood, first for the physical distancing, second, now with vaccines. So we've had a concentrated program of vaccinating about 10,000 people who live in that core neighborhood, because we thought that if those folks are the most vulnerable, but also in terms of spread around the city, that would be the place to concentrate. So I think that's why in the city we've done well. We had an early start in a way too. We had one of the first cases in the country landed in Vancouver. So we were alerted to this very early, work with our public health officials. And I think the province has done a great job too. Like they really have, despite the pushback often from the public, Dr. Bonnie Henry has just been a real leader here. And, but the climate does have a lot to do with why our rates have been low.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And then the one thing I want to pick up that you mentioned there was the sort of greater compliance, right? You mentioned a little bit less of the anti-mask and anti-vax crowd, a greater sort of understanding of in it for everyone. And drawing a comparison in Ontario, here it was announced that there were going to be new police orders for people who were traveling outside their home unnecessarily, and it didn't go very well. I mean, the announcement was sort of rejected by police, rejected by the public, and walked back in a few days. In BC, we've seen a similar type of announcement, a little bit broader, about restricting travel between public health areas, but essentially saying you shouldn't travel between different areas of the province unless absolutely necessary. And that's been going for several weeks now. So is there just a greater sense of compliance, a better level of communication, perhaps, or more clear communication coming from Dr. Bonnie Henry? Is there anything like that you would ascribe the difference in reaction to?
There was, it was quite a difference with the other provinces where the premiers were out talking tough. In most provinces, it was really Bonnie Henry who was leading right from the beginning. John Horgan, our premier, would come in occasionally, but it was always Dr. Bonnie Henry and the health minister. And it was always like the message is, there hasn't been a ton of tough talk. There hasn't been a ton of, we're going to fine you or put you in jail right from the beginning. But I don't want to give, like, I also think the other health officials and premiers deserve a lot of credit. Mm-hmm. The difference here is that there is that extra option of being outside. And that has been a key part of the focus of the health officials since the beginning. Right from the beginning, encourage people to get out, walk, people in parks. We in the city put all these things in our parks in place, signage to remind people to be 6 feet apart, really kind of got that in to the mindset of folks in an early way, in a voluntary way. And we're all in this together kind of approach. And I think we've been very consistent all the way through. We haven't had luckily to really do the stay at home order, but we have right now you can't eat in restaurants, you can eat on the patio or a takeaway, but that's been as far as we've really gone here in the city. And I think because we didn't have that deep lockdown, people's stress levels may not have been as high as they were in other cities across Canada. So again, I just think everybody has been doing a great job. The federal government, and there's always criticism, but this is, geez, it's when we look back at it, it'll be an astounding time. And I think Canada's fared well through it.
Yeah, I said earlier I don't envy the political position, but it's worth pointing out the job that everyone's done to this point. So on that, that we've talked a lot about the pandemic management and the sort of day to day, what's open, what's closed, what
Yeah.
can and can't people do. But the long term consequences for the city are interesting. As the mayor, I can only imagine the financial strain that's been put on the city, drops in transit ridership, that
Yeah.
sort of thing. Certainly haven't been exempted from the financial impact that we're seeing in major cities around the world. So, what does the pandemic mean for the city's finances and sort of capital projects moving
Yeah.
forward? And are there long-term financing issues that we haven't seen bubble to the surface yet?
Yeah, so last year when this hit, the news is pretty dire. I mean, we property taxes fund most of what we do here, but we do have other revenues, say parking. But when nobody was driving, our parking revenues just collapsed. All our community centers were closed. So in the end, I think we ended up with a $90 million loss. Like we brought in $90 million less than we would have. And what was really scary at the beginning too was that before the federal programs were in place, folks were like, "Oh man, I'm out of work now. What do I do?" And there was early information that that might hit our finances even harder. So very worrying at the beginning. In fact, I was so stressed out in my sleep, I cracked my molar from grinding my teeth. Like it was really bad. And then plus we had to lay off 1,800 workers out of our about 10,000. We laid off
Mhm.
basically 20% of our workforce. And I really gotta, we're all trying to digest at three levels of government what was going on, but I really have to commend the Prime Minister and Chrystia Freeland, who really worked almost weekly with the Big City Mayors Caucus to understand what was going on in cities, knowing that we had fewer resources than any. We can't raise income tax. Property tax is a really old tool. So they, for the first time ever, started injecting cash really directly into municipalities, which has been a massive help, not just with our operating expenses, but with things like homelessness, which we've had a really big increase in folks living on the street because of physical distancing orders, forcing people out of shelters and out of single room hotels. So really the response from the federal government, I think, has saved a lot of cities bacon, and then direct cash influence in injections into the transit systems, which are very low ridership levels. So again, it was a real credit to the Prime Minister and his team for recognizing that big cities were really in a tough shape with no tools at our disposal to kind of survive this.
Well, and it's worth pointing out. So, want to pick up on the transit part there. Worth pointing out that TransLink is provincially owned and municipally deliver a lot of the services and those
It's
sorts
so
of things.
complicated, yeah.
So and unique perhaps to Metro Vancouver is the gas tax levy of, I think, about 18.5 cents or so a liter that funds that transit system. And as you can imagine, if people aren't parking, they probably aren't driving anywhere either, right? So that transit injection, has it created long-term financing issues for the transit system, or have the federal government and provincial government assistance programs kind of backstop that for now, so long as the transit system is able to get back on its feet soon?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing to know about the city of Vancouver is that over half our trips in the city are not by automobile. So we have in a metro, we have one of the highest transit ridership rates in North America, which is, and a huge amount of growth over the last few years, a direct result of federal and provincial investment into our transit system. So that's the upside. But when people are staying at home and not riding, working from home, that kind of stuff, yet we
Mhm.
had a major hit to the operating side. But we're quite bullish about the about future capital investments. We think once you get people out of their cars and walking or biking or taking transit, they don't really go back and buy a whole bunch of cars. So we think that it'll probably come back. It might take a little while to do it, but and we need this kind of short-term operational support. But we should really keep our eye on post-pandemic and capital investment. So that's kind of my thought, that I actually think cities are going to be perhaps better off than we were pre-pandemic, just because the feds have kind of got back into the city's game, whether it's transit investment or housing investment. This kind of showed leadership that we saw probably not since the 1970s. So that's great.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point because I was actually I have a question written down here that says something along the lines of you were both a federal MP and now
Right.
mayor. You've been on sort of both sides of this table,
Yeah.
and I was actually kind of curious if you were worried about federal government intervention into your programs in your municipal domain now. But it sounds like it's actually the opposite. If they're coming to the table with funds, it's much better for the city than if they're not doing so. So, do you think that's maybe one of these long-term sort of policy consequences we could see coming out of the pandemic is continued federal investment into municipal areas?
Yeah, I think the brilliance of this approach, and we're like in the US, you've seen lots of national interventions in the cities, which have been disastrous. So I think of the highways that were built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you just decimated cities across the US. That was forced top down. But I think the brilliance of what the Prime Minister and Finance Minister Freeland did is they asked us what we needed. And then actually, not only did we help shape the capital investment plans, we actually fed back into most of their programs. So whether it was CERB or other things, they really genuinely asked our advice and in fact made mid-program adjustments based on what the needs of the big cities were. So like if you can get Montreal, Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, Halifax, others on board, then you know that most of the population, I guess we're in the middle of it. We're the nuts and bolts delivery agency. And so they're custom making, which continues today. So the questions are still, we put aside this much money, which is a very theoretical thing. I mean, in Ottawa, you're sitting on the benches in the House of Commons and you're having all these theoretical arguments. But as mayor, it's like, oh man, I got to get this person off the street tomorrow. What federal program can I access? And I really think the feds have. I think I actually author textbooks about cities, and this will be one of those chapters that we write about where the relationship fundamentally changed for the better, a real partnership.
Yeah, and it's refreshing to hear that, right? To be
Hmm.
honest, to make sure that those levels of government are working together, because I think most people are tired of finger pointing and blaming, and they just want political levels to get along. So when they
Yep.
do, it's a good thing. Maybe it's a negative that it took a pandemic to get us there, but so be it.
I
Um,
do think there was some, like when I came in as mayor, just to be blunt, I was told by my senior civil servants that there was no point talking to the feds because, we never got any money from them, but I didn't care. I just went off and started talking. And eventually the feds have to get money out to deliver on their policy as well. And what they're finding is they get a very quick bang for their buck when they work through cities. And they also get credit for it because when they give money to the provinces, sometimes it's shown as provincial money and not federal money. So I actually think it's a really good relationship that I hope keeps developing.
Yeah, and it's a fair point because I think one of the things the pandemic has exposed is that the federal government it's pretty good at taking money from people. It's a little bit less good at getting money back into people's pockets. It's rightfully so. It's not a bank, but at the same time, the municipalities are on the ground and deliver those services directly to people. So using them to your advantage certainly can help. One of the other areas, which is the third of the ones that you laid out at the top, that you're working with the federal government on, is on the overdosing issue.
Yeah.
I know that you've been working with the federal government on decriminalization of possession of various drugs, and I think it's a good segue to get in that topic. So you were, I want to just maybe I'll just let you kind of take the torch with that.
Sure.
Where is that at? How is that going? What's the reception been like from the federal government, and what's the progress like so far?
Yeah, so I mean, British Columbia has been the center of really the opioid epidemic here in Canada, although it's spreading to other provinces. And Vancouver was really the center of the BC epidemic. I mean, we're still one person a day is dying here of an overdose in our city still. And these aren't strangers. These are folks. It'd be hard to meet somebody in Vancouver that hasn't been touched by this personally. And so there is an overwhelming level of support from the public to take, I think, more. Uh, to take stronger measures. We thought, well, what's the best thing we can do? Originally, my mandate, we worked very hard to get to what's called a safe supply, which is really that doctors will prescribe a substitute drug for the illicit drug that you're taking. So substitutes for heroin and cocaine and fentanyl. And the federal government during the pandemic did issue orders for that to be allowed, and the provincial government has also done that. So that has been something we've been working at the city level to facilitate. And what that will do is essentially get people off their poison drugs and stabilize them. And also, because they're prescribed, it means that they don't have to go off and do the things they need to do to raise the money to buy their illicit drugs. So it is a very promising step forward. And luckily, both the Prime Minister and Premier are both very supportive of this. So that's great, just not rolling out fast enough. But on decriminalization, that's if you're walking along the street and you're stopped for jaywalking or something, and the cops find a small amount of heroin or cocaine or crystal meth or whatever on you, you actually can get charged for possession, and then you end up be criminalized for this behavior. So informally, we've had decriminalization in Vancouver for a long time. I mean, cops really don't ever press. I think there were 6 possession charges last year that were followed through on. However, they do seize the drug still. So when you're if you're addicted to heroin and police seize your heroin, then you have to put yourself in more risky situations in order to get the drug that you need to survive. So what decriminalization will do is to mean that if say you're caught shoplifting or something, the police find X amount of cocaine on you, they would not press charges, and they won't be able to seize the drugs. So how this is enabled is through the Minister of Health signs an exemption to the Controlled Substances Act. And so I asked council if they were into this. They unanimously passed a motion for me to pursue this. I wrote to Health Canada, and Health Canada said, yes, we would entertain an application for this, and we're almost finished with our application now. So it's, those are strange meetings to be in, and I think only in Vancouver at this point. I know other mayors are quite interested, but because I know I have the public support for this, I think we can be the place to pilot this in Canada.
So that's actually what I was going to ask about as a follow-up, because you're right. It's obviously a fairly progressive measure. It's something that's not necessarily in other municipalities, despite interest being there. But at the same time, you've got all 3 levels of government have supported it in some way. You've got local mental health agencies, even policing groups, police forces have signed on in terms of support.
Yep.
Is it just are people finally waking up to how bad the opioid epidemic is in the city? What is it that makes the sort of the why now question? Because you're the first out the gate. What is it about Vancouver specifically that has allowed people to support this publicly in other places where it might be a bit more of a stretch for people?
Yeah, first of all, it's community driven. I mean, so we had the first safe consumption site that was brought in 2002, in 2003 in Vancouver. And that was driven by the community who were setting up their own sites, really, and offering supervision while you're injecting drugs. That was eventually adopted by, as a larger health model, and we've got many overdose prevention sites in the city now. Same with decriminalization. That's been driven by the community. They've been calling for it forever. I mean, many would go as far as legalization for all drugs. I just don't think that's where we can go at this point. But what was extraordinary is the community pushed for it. And then the police, actually the Vancouver Police Department, also endorsed decriminalization. And that kind of left it for us to do. I guess there's an advantage of being in Ottawa for so long too, is you see windows of opportunity, right? You see, oh, this minister may be open to this where the last minister wasn't. And because I had a relationship with, being in the House of Commons with Minister Haydu, although we were on opposite sides of the House of Commons, I knew that she had a harm reduction background and would be open to this. So I really think, I think this is possible because we have a champion in cabinet. I don't think it would have been possible with previous health ministers.
Yeah, so that's actually the last question I wanted to ask you, and is about that jump from federal politics to municipal politics. I once did a provincial internship with a guy who's actually from Vancouver, and he wrote his end term paper on municipal politicians making the jump up to provincial. And that's normally the way you see it run. They go from the lower tier up to the provincial or federal level of government. Obviously, going down to mayor of Vancouver is still a pretty big position. I think you gained constituents in the move, so so it's still obviously quite a large position, but it's a bit unique. You don't see that very often. So how big of a risk was that for you politically to go from a federal seat to making the run mayorally? And to the point you just made, has it been an advantage for you in dealing with other levels of government?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm a cities guy. I mean, I did my master's on cities. I worked at the city planning department of Vancouver for a while. I did my PhD on cities. Like, I read about cities all the time. And I thought when Gregor Robertson said he wasn't running again, who I think was a good mayor, there was an opportunity to run. And so I thought, I'll go for it. Politics is always messy. It's never a good time to do it. You just have to do it. And so that's what happened. And I was lucky enough to win. All my elections have been close. Like, I've never won an election by over 1,000 votes anyway. So, it's I was kind of used to high risk endeavors politically. So that's all good. But also I've written a bunch of papers about even though you only have a certain amount of authority under the Vancouver Charter or Municipal Act, you can do a lot, but with the position that you hold. So you can punch way above your weight if you want to. And that's kind of, so I said, well, I wrote this thing down. I better try to do it. And that's why I think, even though I don't have formal authority over decriminalizing drugs, I can certainly make the case for it and find ways to make it happen. I think and that's the same with housing delivery or even fighting COVID. Is how do you bring together coalitions of people to move things ahead? And so I do think Ottawa really helped me, though, because I worked across the aisle a lot. I mean, I co-wrote a book with Michael Chong and Scott Sims, conservative and a liberal. I backed many bills that, there was a joke that I was the most popular MP in all parties but my own. So I really took kind of an academic, let's, get the best solution here. And I think that held over. So when I talk to MPs now that I serve with, or ministers, they know I'm a straight shooter. I might get arrested to stop a pipeline, but that's because I believe it needs to be stopped, not for political gain. So that served me well, I think. But the 7 years in Ottawa really helped me understand how Ottawa works as well as anybody can, and to use that knowledge to deliver in Vancouver.
Yeah, well, it sounds like the experience has led to lots of progress for the citizens of Vancouver and for your role as mayor so far, based on the conversation we've had today. The other thing that being mayor of Vancouver gets you is it gets you an invite onto the podcast. So you feel free to come back anytime.
Oh, anytime.
We really appreciate the time today, Mayor. It was a great conversation.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corps. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corps. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.